Let's look at this and some of the other front pages and main political headlines this morning. Connor Tomlinson joins us, Policy Director at the British Conservation Alliance, which operates at more than 30 universities, focusing on market-based free enterprise solutions to environmental issues. He is also a Young Voices UK contributor. Connor, hello.
Good morning, Callum. How are you?
Good morning. Yes, I'm well, thank you. Right, let's start with Macron versus Le Pen. So it's going to be these two once again in the French presidential election in the second round. The front page of the Times, old parties of the left and right humiliated. 28% for Macron, 23% for Le Pen. So there's a little bit of breathing room between the two. How do you assess this as it heads for the second round?
Well, I thought it was very interesting that the centre-right and centre-left old guard fell behind either Zemmour, who everyone's characterising as far-right, or the communists, which are obviously far-left. And it also is quite interesting that the redefinition of far-right and far-left is happening at the moment, because for what a lot of maybe those outside the deep in the weeds philosophical politicos might not know, is the terms left and right actually came from pre-revolutionary France, where the right were the monarchists and the left were the revolutionary Rousseauian Jacobins. So it's a bit strange to kind of apply those labels now, and not only France is a very republican nation, but they sort of slipped into colloquialisms and don't really mean much. But the fact that Zemmour has even had any influence over this, saying that France should not be the Santa Claus of the world, he's basically speaking for the id of the French people that are kind of concerned about the level of mass migration and cultural incompatibilities, as we've seen with the numerous terrorist attacks on France, which have claimed so many lives so tragically. I think even though he hasn't made much of an electoral impact, he only got something about 7% of the vote, he has actually moved the conversation quite notably to the point of where even Macron was accusing Le Pen of being soft on Islamist terrorism at one point.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think it's fair to say in this French election there is more of a focus on foreign policy, probably primarily really because of the situation in Ukraine. And I think that is one of the issues that's kind of becoming a bit of a wedge. Of course, there was a picture emerged in the last few days of Marine Le Pen, recirculated is perhaps the best way to say it, of Marine Le Pen with Vladimir Putin, for example. And I just wonder if it's issues like that are kind of defining this election.
I'd be surprised, actually, because it seems that Le Pen's actually dropped her 2017 promise for a Frexit. Now, I wouldn't be shocked if she started making the rounds on that if she were to get elected. I won't bet all on black and say it's a certainty, but it's definitely not impossible. I think, actually, as the Gilets jaunes have proved with their over 60 weeks of consecutive protests during Macron's term, that a lot of the issues, much like over here, that French people are concerned about are kitchen table issues, is the cost of food, the cost of fuel, etc. And even though Boris, for example, seems to think that Ukraine will definitely reform his reputation after Partygate, I don't think Macron dressing like Zelensky and doing all those weird photo ops is going to reform his reputation on issues like immigration, for example.
Interesting. I want to just play you this, which is from Peter Conradi, the Sunday Times Europe editor, who puts this first round into context for us.
Let's stick with the assumption that it still is Macron and Le Pen and that Mélenchon hasn't quite closed the gap. Then the question is, who rallies round to vote for Macron even though they really didn't like him much the first time round? That's the case so far as supporters of Valérie Pécresse, the centre-right leader, the sort of the heir to the Gaullist party, who did very, very badly indeed, got less than 5%, urged her voters to back Macron in the second round, as have most of the people on the left. Mélenchon himself hasn't quite gone that far. He's suggested to his voters that they should certainly vote against Le Pen.
Peter Conradi there. You can read more analysis in the Times today. Go to thetimes.co.uk to get a digital subscription, or you can pick up a paper. Connor, let's go on to discuss the Chancellor, shall we? And I don't know, I was about to say his woes. Is he getting past this financial issue? He's asking Lord Geit, the independent advisor on ministers' interests, to review the various declarations of interest that he has made since joining the government to assess whether he has been fully transparent. Are you content with the level of transparency that we now have on Rishi Sunak and indeed his wife's financial arrangements?
Oh, Callum, you know me better than ever to be too content with the level of transparency shown in the government. I can't believe I'm going to say it. It might be because it's so early in the morning, but I actually somewhat agree with the Lib Dems and their proposal, which will probably make it never past the Commons, in that pretty much everyone involved in government should declare their tax status. I think they should go a bit further and do what the American Congress have to do as well, and declare their stocks, because I think there's going to be some very interesting crisis profiteering there. But I think the main issue with Rishi Sunak is not that his wife necessarily declared non-dom status prior to his tenure as Chancellor, or that even had a green card prior to his tenure as Chancellor. It's the fact that she wasn't paying any income tax, was flying in the face of sort of British sense of fairness. I don't care if anyone really wants to circumvent using existing tax law the amount of tax they have to pay, because a lot of our public services are black holes that need serious reform and have been mismanaged. But I do care if you're the one setting the tax brackets and then essentially treat the national debt, which you've accrued through money printing, inflation, which is a stealth tax, and higher tax rises, as a job for the little people. It doesn't seem right, and it makes you look even more disconnected than critics who say you're too wealthy to be Chancellor at a time of crisis would land those blows on you.
So Akshata Murthy, who is Rishi Sunak's wife, will now pay UK taxes on her overseas income. Ministers insist it's time to move on from the controversy. Labour says there are a lot more questions for the Chancellor to answer. Do you have questions? What more do you need from the Chancellor at this point?
Well, I think we need a sort of root and branch mission by anyone who's in the government who's circumvented these same things while also setting the rules. It's the same sort of thing with Partygate, really. It's the people who have got us into this mess weren't really treating it as a crisis at the time, and also aren't really treating it as a problem to be solved. I'm less concerned about the infighting between number 10 and number 11, which this seems to be, according to one of the senior Tory sources that says it in the Mail. He's actually attributed much to quite a few of our suspicions, some of the photos during Partygate to be coming from number 11 directly. So this might be a bit of infighting. I'm less interested in that. I'm really interested in them getting on with the job of governance. I don't really think they're capable of doing it, as their track record has shown, but I'll take some transparency and some good policy if they're willing to dish it out.
Let us consider COVID at this point then, just as a brief final thought, which is arguably what it's become for the government as well. Health bosses want new measures to curb the spread of coronavirus, warning that hospitals face a brutal Easter as bad as any winter. The NHS Confederation accusing Downing Street of abandoning any interest in COVID whatsoever as hospitals struggle with record infections. I think two things on this, Conor. One, do you agree with that assessment that Downing Street has abandoned any interest? And two, if that is the case, as hospitals struggle with record infections, to what extent should Downing Street start showing interest again?
Well, I don't think it's capable of showing too much interest, namely because, to parrot the words of someone else who I don't particularly like, Bill Gates said the Omicron is the glorious natural vaccine. And I think we should be pretty thankful that it's come rather quickly compared to the evolution of some other respiratory viruses and is comparably quite milder. Of course, it's still floating around and can still cause death for people with comorbidities. I've just had a family member who had a stroke and bowel cancer, and COVID was on her death certificate. It essentially finished her off, but it's going to circulate throughout hospitals where there's an abundance of comorbidities, where people are most at risk. But I don't see how the numbers are particularly, I'm not going to say right, but the estimates seem quite high, but they aren't actually publishing accurate statistics, and they can't because there's no longer widespread testing. Now, that's for financial reasons, for the fact that it's slightly milder, for the fact that it's not very sustainable to keep dumping plastic in our oceans that we bought from China. But they're estimating of 4.1 million. Well, in the weekly vaccine reports for week 14, there was no death, no case, or no hospital statistics, even though there were in week 13. And in week 13, they were mainly among people who have already had triple jabs. I think we've got to the point of where we've got the most protection we can and just sort of have to get on with it without making another black hole in public finance.
Conor, appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Speak soon. That's Conor Tomlinson, Young Voices UK contributor and policy director at the British Conservation Alliance. Of